This was about as bizarre and as easy as it gets.
So the number for me was a number that would allow me to never have to work again.
I feel like we got top.
I went from a sale of $500,000 to in debt.
$192 million.
This is Built to Sell Radio with your host, John Warrilow.
This episode of Built to Sell Radio is brought to you by Pre-Score. What on earth is a pre-score? Pre stands for personal readiness to exit your company. And here we're looking to evaluate how personally ready you are to leave your company. You know, when you go to sell a business to have a successful exit and look back on it without regret, you need two things. Number one, a company that is attractive to an acquirer, to a company that's built to sell. And number two, you personally need to be ready to exit that business. We found that there are 4 drivers of a happy and lucrative exit, 4 ways you can personally ready yourself to exit your business. And by completing your pre-score, you are going to see how you're performing against those 4 major drivers of a happy and lucrative exit. Just go to prescore.com. All right, my guess is that you've considered at some point selling your company to a direct competitor. My guess is that it also makes you feel just a little bit squeamish. The idea of selling to a direct threat, you've got to reveal all of your confidential information, all your business process to someone who could take advantage of that information if they choose not to follow through on their acquisition offer. My next guest built a company called 360PI. His name is Alex Rink, and he sold to a direct competitor, but he did it in a really intelligent way. He shares some really fascinating insights. A couple that pop for me. Number one, the importance of leaving a little bit of field left to plow. The idea that there's a big opportunity that an acquirer can take advantage of that you have not already gone after. Number two, strategic acquirers usually can pay a little bit more for your company. And Alex will go on to describe how and why that's the case. He'll also talk about something called staged disclosures, a way for you to minimize the risk of selling to a direct competitor. Here for the entire story is Alex Rink. Enjoy. Alex Rink, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks very much, John. Pleasure to be
So,
here.
360PI, what did you guys do?
So we're a software as a service based in Ottawa, Canada. What we did was what's called retail price intelligence. So essentially that's having really large scale crawlers going out and pulling in the price information from e-commerce websites, aggregating that, comparing and matching products to ensure that you're getting the right kind of pricing on the right products, and then providing the intelligence and insights from that back to retailers to help them to price their products and or decide whether they even want to sort of like continue listing that product based upon whatever revenues and margins they're going to get for the pricing that they've got compared to the market.
That's really cool. So if I'm Staples, for example, I could say, I'm going to subscribe and I want you to check out the price of 8.5, 11 paper for printers. I want you to check Walmart and Amazon and every other retailer, and then tell me if my pricing is sort of in the range. Is that the kind of idea?
Yeah, that's exactly the right idea. And I mean, and then you've even picked sort of a good area, which is sort of like office products. We did tend to focus on sort of durables and consumer electronics and so on. So some of our customers are like Build.com, Ace Hardware, Best Buy, Overstock.com, Home Depot. And the one thing I would add, you gave an example of a specific product and a few stores and so on. What we really focused on and where we were very good is that we had algorithms and systems in place, highly scalable systems to do enormous volumes. So we had clients where we would be doing over 1 million products every single day across sort of 10, 20, 30 different retailers. And so everybody knows about how Amazon's very competitive on pricing. Well, they do this themselves, but most other retailers don't have the sort of technical and financial chops, to invest in those kind of capabilities themselves. And as a result, third-party providers such as 360PI came to market to be able to deliver that kind of service for them.
you deal with, because on one hand, you're an amazing source of insight for an e-tailer like a Staples, as an example. On the other hand, you're kind of the bad guy because you're also crawling their site, right? And getting their information and selling it to their competitors. Like was that like a point of contention with clients?
Yeah, from time to time, I think most of the time, really the client should mostly be thinking about how do I get this intelligence? Like, I think they just sort of realized, I got a choice here. Either I participate in this and I get this information, or I don't, in which case I'm blind and other people can be getting it. So, certainly from our perspective, we wanted to conduct ourselves, with the greatest integrity with clients. And so we'd have Chinese walls. We would serve multiple clients in, for example, the home improvement space or consumer electronics or whatever. But we'd never have, the situations where, the specific information on, that we were doing for one client is going necessarily to the other client. We're treating each client, for individually in terms of what it is they're looking for and ensuring that we're giving them, what they are requesting.
And that's helpful. And what was the business model? You mentioned you charged these clients on a SaaS basis or software as a service basis. Was it 100% SaaS? Was there some service revenue associated with it, or what was the makeup there?
Yeah, it was almost exclusively SaaS revenue. Every once in a while, there was a small amount of services revenue, and every once in a while, there was an opportunity to do more in terms of services. I'll say that, by and large, I don't want to say resisted getting into services, but, we just tried to stay as close as we could and focus as much as possible on the SaaS side of things and try and bundle it up, in that and the recurring revenue component. And a big part of that, to be perfectly honest, was, just thinking, and I mentioned, to you earlier, in the sort of like introduction that I had read your book, during the time that I was a CEO at 360. And so, just sort of realizing around multiples around services revenue versus recurring, SaaS subscription revenue. What I always tried to the balance I tried to strike was, is this service revenue going to somehow lead to more business, or is it just going to be sort of like a, one-time effort? And if it would help to get the client up, installed and so on, then obviously it's sometimes, I don't want to call it a necessary evil because it's, it's revenue and you're happy to do it and so on. But, for the most part, we kind of try to look at it from a perspective of how do we make this product and capability as easy for them to adopt as possible so that it does require as little service as possible and that we can really kind of get them up and started and using the recurring revenue service as opposed to, having to dedicate staff to them.
Got it. And so you were the CEO of 360 PI. How did you become the CEO? Because I understand you didn't create the company or start the company. Maybe talk us through the genesis of the company, how you got involved. Sure.
So 360 PI was actually the third, my third sort of entrepreneurial endeavor. I'd done a couple of others where I was, a CEO and co-founder. And with 360, I was at a stage where I had transitioned out of a previous business and I was exploring opportunities and someone sort of introduced me to an individual who was CEO of a company in Ottawa, and they had incubated this idea, and the original, idea, they called it Gazero. And it was a business to consumer comparison shopping engine. So what that means is people would go to the site and they would look at products and, search for those products and then see what the pricing was on those products, at other retailers. Mm-hmm. And I remember being taken by it because I liked the analytics. I liked, from a shopping perspective, being able to save money on products. It had this sort of like mission of like providing honest recommendations to consumers around, where's the best place to buy products and so on. And so I became attracted to that. And by that point, this was 2010. The original sort of incubating company had actually put in over $2 million really building out this technology platform, but they had pretty much run aground with it. They were trying to really sort of drive up the user base and get more people visiting and getting people clicking through, and then you get money from affiliate marketing and so on. And it simply, frankly, just wasn't working. I mean, the month before I joined, the revenues at the company were $1,000, literally. And this is sort of like 2.5 years in.
Okay.
Yeah. But
first rung on the ladder.
But, like I said, I thought there was a lot of potential and opportunity there. And I had a fair amount of experience in doing a couple of other software as a service, or, was, a number of years ago known as an application service provider type of business.
Yeah.
And so it just seemed like a situation where, hey, they've got a great technical platform, but they're looking for a CEO to really, figure out how to get to product market fit with this business. And for my part, I would be able to, skip a lot of the kind of early learning and so on and testing and, building out a technology platform. So I joined in June of 2010.
And by the way, they'd invested a lot of money. I mean, they invested a couple of $1 million, so it wasn't without some horsepower behind it. How did you structure your compensation? Did you get some shares or some options, or did you buy in? Like, what was your piece of the action?
Yeah, great question. So, at the time that I joined, they had already, as you said, put in, a pretty fair amount of money, and they were actually keeping the company afloat with debt financing. So they had kind of said, okay, no more kind of like investment capital. Now we're going to do, and debt financing. And
who would lend them money?
Well,
with $1,000.
Yeah, sorry. The incubating company was now putting money in on like a debt basis because they they wanted to ensure that if anything happened, they would be able to keep the IP.
Yeah.
And so when I joined, I knew that we had basically about a year of runway, and the funds that were being put in were maintaining the development team that was there. And I was like, okay, I've got to basically figure this out within a year. And so to your point about compensation, I didn't actually draw any cash compensation to start, which doesn't mean that I didn't sort of like account for it. We sort of like figured out, what was the amount that, that I would be deriving, but I was actually deferring my revenue for, my income for the first little while. And in addition, sort of, negotiated absolutely sort of a share package and so on. So it ended up being initial share sort of grant. There was the deferred compensation, a large portion of which I actually ended up converting into shares. And then there were options as well.
Got it. And was that the part of your your salary that you deferred? Did you structure that as convertible debt in effect? Was that the legal structure, or was it just sort of on the back of a napkin? Like, hey, we all agree that, hey, first time there's some money, I'm going to get paid. Well, did you structure it formally or not?
If I were doing this again, I would structure it formally. At the time, we actually kept it informal, and I think we trusted each other enough that that worked out. But I can definitely say that there could be situations where that wouldn't work out. So if I were doing it again, I would structure it formally. But at the time, we didn't, and it was informal. And like I said, it worked out fine.
So you got to get in on the ground floor of this business, but you made a fairly significant U-turn from the business to consumer model to what eventually was a business to business model. What precipitated that?
Yeah, great question. It was really, it was a really interesting situation because, again, when I joined this company, I thought, oh, you know what, we can really sort of amp up the number of users visiting this site. I love kind of, the mission here and what we're doing and so on. But there were a few things that, as I got into it that concerned me. One of the things that you actually mentioned frequently in your book and generally in your webinars is dependency. And one of the big dependencies that, and I guess from my previous entrepreneurial ventures, I have become somewhat averse to dependencies, through experience. And I'm sure you've heard the expression that sort of, what is it? Good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment.
Right. Yeah, I've
had enough bad judgment, which has led to experience, that hopefully I've gotten some good judgment out of that. But we had an enormous dependency, which was, and this was not only us, but basically anyone who was in this comparison shopping engine space, which is, if you're making your money from affiliate marketing, what that really means is you're trying to drive as many users to your site as possible, or visitors, and then they look at what they want to buy and so on, and they click and then they go through to the site where they end up purchasing. And well, where are those visitors coming from? I mean, typically those visitors coming from, that they made a search on Google. And so we had like over 90% of our traffic was coming in from Google. And so there was both an opportunity and a threat there. The opportunity was to significantly ramp up our search engine marketing, the SEO, the organic, search engine terms, so that if people were looking for something, we would appear. But the challenge there was, we were at 50,000 users a month. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, we had such low revenue. Whereas there were other comparison shopping engines who had been out for a while that had 15 to 25 million users per month.
Wow.
So they were dominating, the top few, search engine results. And for us to get up there, we had to either significantly amp up what we were doing from an SEO perspective and or be so much different and better than anybody else in terms of the analytics and capabilities that we would offer on our site, that we would end up creating sort of a loyal user base that would keep coming back to us. And I just didn't feel that was realistic in the time frame that we had. I was also, back to the dependency point, quite concerned about the possibility that, well, what if Google changes its search engine algorithm, which has been known to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that was one of the key reasons we started looking around. Another one, which is subtle, but actually was really important to me, was we had this sort of like slogan, which I mentioned, like honest recommendations for consumers. And we were trying to do that by, giving the price analytics and showing sort of where the price had been historically and saying, hey, this is a good time to buy or not a good time to buy or whatever. So we were not only saying how the price compares to other stores, but we were also telling you where that price was compared to where it had been historically. And then we came up with this novel idea of a deal score. So we'd say, hey, this is a 9.5 out of 10 deal score. Like, you really should want to take advantage of this one. Or, you know what, this one's a 3 out of 10 because even though you're saving $50 on it, it was actually $100 off last week. So loved the mission that we were going for, but the way that we were making money, and this is again sort of 2010 timeframe, is by people clicking through to go purchase. So when you think about that, we are monetarily incented to try and get as many
people bad deals.
Yeah, to like click through,
Yeah. And
I just felt that there was this fundamental disconnect or like a lack of integrity, if you like. And I don't say that in a negative sense. I just mean it from like this disconnect between what we were purporting to do in terms of mission and the way that we were making money. And I think your mission and how you make money in order to be effective should really be structurally aligned.
Got it. And so you migrated to the business-to-business model.
Yeah. And I would say the third factor is just because we knew that there was a limit to how much money, how long we were going to be getting money, we needed to generate funds for the business, right? Before you can succeed, you need to survive. We needed to figure out survival. And there's no way we were going to be able to realistically raise funds from investors with a broken model, with $2.5 million having been invested, with no significant revenues and so on. And given my experience in the B2B space, it just seemed like a natural place to go to try and, earn your money the old fashioned way, like actually deliver value to customers. And so it just, we started to approach retailers. And when we got calls back, we realized, hey, you know what, we might be onto something here.
What would a typical retailer pay for a 360 PI contract? Like, how much would that cost them a year?
Yeah. So we ended up, we were the premium provider in our space. We had higher quality. We really sort of like hung our hat on our quality. And we got to the point where essentially, because of the nature of the scalability that we were offering, like we'd really have to, put effort into setting up a customer. And then, like I said, also the quality, we'd have a minimum threshold of $25,000 a year. Anything below that, it's not to say that in the early days we wouldn't, do the occasional one, but we got to a point where we just said, you know what, we would put it into our sort of like sales qualification discussions, because we just realized, like, look, if someone's trying to put $5,000 or $10,000, it's just not going to be worth it for us to do. And it's too much of an opportunity cost versus other, deals that we can go after.
Got it. And the investors in the business, when you joined during this time, who are they? Are they individuals, companies, an incubator? Like, what is capital structure? Who put up the $2.5 million bucks?
Yeah, so it's a services business in Ottawa, and essentially they had government contracts and some enterprise contracts, and they had a very innovative co-founder there who really sort of wanted to do advanced technology work, and he ended up starting up again the predecessor company 360PI, which is called Gazero. We eventually rebranded it, to your point, as we switched to B2B, we rebranded it 360PI. But he then actually ended up leaving the company and going to California and starting up a very well-funded, essentially, think of Airbnb for cars. It's a company called GetAround. And so his name's Sam Zaid, and he started up the original idea. And then I took it on and ran that business. And then meanwhile, he went to California and started up another business, which has been certainly successful in getting a lot of attention, raising a lot of funds. Fantastic.
So Sam is his name?
Sam.
So he was playing with house money in the sense that it wasn't his money. He was a co-founder of the service. I guess it was his money partially by extension.
Yeah, so Sam was a co-founder in this sort of like services business called Aption. Aption was the business that incubated Gazero. And there was someone named Brian who was actually running Aption at the time. So while Sam kind of came up with the idea and Brian sort of supported it and they both put money in, they were, as you say, playing with house money of Aption. And so Aption ended up being the shareholder, and both Brian and Sam served on our board subsequently.
Got it. And so what was their reaction to this fairly significant pivot? You come in and say, we're not going to do B2C, we're going to do B2B. How did they react to that?
Honestly, I think they were happy with it. I think when they brought me on, they were just sort of like, we run aground. We're not really sure what to do here. We're looking for someone to take this on. Please, help us out.
Make us some money.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, when we demonstrated to them that, we were getting traction, that, the retailers were signing up, I think they were happy to see that, that something was coming of the platform that had been built.
So as you grew, how big did you get this before you decided to sell? What kind of number of employees or revenue, or what was your metric for when you got, how big did you get before you sold?
Yeah. So when we were acquired, it was in April 2017 was the actual sort of acquisition date. And, again, we took it from zero we got to mid 7 figures in revenues. We were 40 employees, which 35 full-time and then 5 part-time, doing some data, analysis work for us.
Got it. And what did you think a company like that would be worth before you took it to market? Did you have some intelligence, some sense of what you thought the company was worth based on what you were seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, just ranges really, not sort of like specific numbers. But, like a general idea. I know that we had the option. It was sort of like, it always comes down to a matter of time and like, what's the right time to sort of go to market? And, I'm sure we'll get into this question, but there were a set of factors that had us say, now is about the right time. And, so, I mean, we'd certainly have discussions with VCs around potential financing and get some idea around valuation benchmarks. And we figured that those would more or less play out from an acquisition perspective as well.
And what kind of benchmarks were the VCs giving you?
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of depends. But I mean, typically, there'd be anywhere from sort of like 15 to, $30 million type of thing. So.
Oh, okay. So this is acquisition price. I was actually thinking of multiple of revenue or multiple of EBITDA.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it would generally be, it wasn't EBITDA. We were operationally profitable. So we weren't kind of one of those, really, pedal to the metal in terms of the growth and, and making almost the same number.
No money. Yeah.
EBITDA. So it was primarily a revenue multiple. But I will say that the revenue multiples at that time weren't what they are now. I think, if you look at sort of like SaaS valuation benchmarks, I mean, they're in the stock market generally. And of course that impacts, what VCs and PE firms are willing to pay. I think they've gone up a fair amount over the course of the last sort of 5 to 10 years.
So I'm going to back into it and say they were you were seeing numbers in the sort of 3 to 6 times revenue. Was that ish in that sort of ballpark?
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. So still like really healthy multiples. I mean, especially for someone that's outside of the SaaS space, it's like an astronomical multiple relative to, some other less technical businesses. You mentioned there were some circumstances around that made it feel like it was the right time to sell. What were they, and what triggered your decision?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really sort of interesting situation because we had some really great tailwinds when we pivoted the business. The iPhone had come out in 2006 and was really, starting to pick up steam, and then obviously Android devices, and so mobile adoption generally. And I picked that out intentionally because one of the applications of mobile devices was people barcode scanning products in stores and being able to view the prices. And so that really put retailers at a disadvantage. They'd historically been the ones who knew more about pricing the consumers, but that, script flipped really quickly with mobile devices, with the diffusion of mobile devices. And so all of a sudden retailers were at this huge disadvantage in terms of knowing about pricing. And that's one of the things that really helped us because they felt like, oh my gosh, we need, more current information, and we can't keep doing this manually and sending people into stores and, putting in spreadsheets and so on. So the need for that kind of a scalable solution became very important. I'll also add, there were huge tailwinds in terms of, this is 2010, 11, 12 timeframe, coming out of the sort of 2008 downturn, right? So, a lot of behavior was around how do I save money? So I think the combination of those two, really, gave a big lift. However, if you then kind of like project that forward a few years, Amazon was, taking like over 50% of every incremental e-commerce dollar spent. Wow. And did you
say 50%?
Yeah.
50?
Yeah. Oh. And to the point where, when people would do a search for a product, they actually were more likely, it came to the point where they're more likely to start their search on Amazon than Google. Right? So that is a level of dominance that Amazon was having in the space. And so, we did a great job of getting a number of marquee clients. We were exceptional in service. Our net promoter score was typically anywhere, 40 to 60. So our customers were very loyal. We were winning service awards. We had a great brand, like I said, premium pricing. But Amazon was ultimately sort of like sucking the oxygen out of the room, for other retailers. And so what you'd have is like a growing number of retailer insolvencies, one. And for those that weren't insolvent, an increasing number of them were cutting back on sort of expenses.
Sure.
And so while we did very well on retention, we'd typically be sort of like 85, 90% plus in terms of retention levels.
Logo or revenue?
I'm sorry?
Logo or revenue retention?
We measured it mostly by revenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 80 to 90% revenue retention per year.
Yeah. Plus, yeah. And, and growing clients and so on. So net retention was, over 100%. But, when we would lose an account, it was either because, they went insolvent, or they were under such, dire financial, in such a dire financial situation that they just like were looking to cut costs, and, and then it was sort of like, a negative cycle, and, we knew they wouldn't necessarily be around.
Sure.
So for us, we knew at that point, it was like, we need, and by the way, Amazon, like I said, had all these capabilities themselves. So they're not a logical customer. So at that point, we felt that there was actually another pivot possibility, not as large. You mentioned before U-turn. It was literally 180 degrees, the first pivot. This was more like a 90-degree pivot, which was to essentially retool the capabilities and offer them to manufacturers. Because when you look at, we would look in our database and we would see, okay, let's say we've got 35 retailers, and let's look at number of manufacturers that are represented by all the products that we are crawling for those 35, retailers. And, there were literally I remember doing taking a look at the results. There were over 3,000 brands that had over sort of like, I think it was 500 products listed. So a really significant number of brands and manufacturers that we could go after. But what they're looking for was slightly different. And they were not yet at the place that retailers were in terms of, offering to consumers. brands are just a little bit further removed. They were typically, using retailers as their channel. So it's just different things that they would be looking for, which would require, like I said, further investment and retooling of our capabilities. So all doable. And by the way, other companies, who have survived in the space and succeeded did exactly that pivot. But I think from our side, this is a sort of like 2016 kind of time frame. I'd been in the business 6 years and I had a certain sort of equity stake and so on. And, the original, and we had, by the way, VC investors and so on, but the original, company Action had been in the business for, by that point, sort of 9 years. So it was a really significant, amount of time for them. And, given how much they had put in much earlier, we're talking sort of like 2007 to 2010 timeframe, at some point they wanted to realize, return on what they had put in. So I think that the combination, it ended up being this sort of like confluence of different things. Like one is, all right, core market, still operationally profitable, but growth is slowing. Opportunity to go after this new market, but it's going to require either sort of like, slow organic growth to like fund it from the core business, or go raise additional financing, which will imply dilution for the initial investors. The amount of time the initial investors have been in there. We had a VC investor where we were there. They were very focused on a geographic area, and we were their only investment that was outside of that, that geographic area. So it just ended up being a set of different things that had us say, we should probably take a look, at what the market would bear here.
Got it. And so what was next? Did you go to market yourself? Did you hire representation? What did you do?
Yeah, so this happened in August of 2016 that we had this discussion, and then sort of, I don't know, coincidentally and fortuitously in October we ended up getting an incoming offer, and it wasn't like we were specifically trying to drum it up. It just sort of came in, and then we had been like having discussions with that company, but we were obviously pleased because it was at least a starting point. And then
how was the offer? What was your reaction to the offer relative to what you'd heard, the kind of 3 to 6 times revenue? Like, did it sort of meet your expectations, or was it way outside?
It was,
Okay. Kind of a low ball.
Yeah. I was like, hey, nice to have an offer, but not excited by this.
Okay. Got it.
And then like, as it happened, we then got another incoming inquiry sort of like within 2 weeks of that. And it was sort of like, wow, when it rains, it pours. What's going on here? And then to your point, at that stage, and I'd already been sort of like gearing up for this after we had this discussion, board discussion in August. I was already sort of like gearing up, to I don't want to call it do a road show, but, just really sort of drum up interest amongst prospective partners and so on. Mm-hmm. And obviously it is super helpful to have, I don't want to call it a bird in hand, but at least a bird that's, pretty interested. Because it made like all of the subsequent discussions that much more meaningful. And I could really, talk about partnership, but also talk about the growth prospects and the vision and where we're going and so on, knowing that there was this, if not a backstop, an emerging backstop of an offer, that we could always kind of fall back to if necessary. But obviously, because we weren't super excited about it, we wanted to get something better.
Mm-hmm. How'd you do that?
I mean, really just sort of like looking at larger companies in the space for whom we would be a natural fit. And a number of these, we had actually invested in business development prior. So we had a set of different partners, and it was natural to go to some of those companies. But we even extended it beyond that. I had been to trade shows. I had met CEOs of other companies, and I would just, reach out and essentially network with them. And, and then just start a conversation around, hey, I'd like to explore a partnership, and we're looking at our strategic options and so on.
And did you use words like partnership and strategic options as code for, look, we're looking to get acquired here?
Yeah. I mean, I think, everybody uses the expression sort of like great companies are acquired, not sold. So I certainly didn't go out with, hey, we're looking to sell the business. It was, as you said, a little bit more subtle approach, but I think subtle, but, with enough implication, and actually, sorry, like, let me actually clarify. it was certainly subtle in the beginning, but then as we'd have the discussions, then I might let in that we actually had received an offer from someone else, which would then kind of get them, if they were sort of somewhat considering it, start, putting the thought into their mind. And it would help us to qualify whether, they might actually be interested in participating or not.
And did you reveal the name of the company that had made the acquisition offer? Okay.
No, never. Yeah, I mean, we could have, and it would have added credibility. I shouldn't say we could have. I believe we were bound by non-disclosure. So I certainly wouldn't from that perspective. But even if we weren't bound by non-disclosure, I don't think I would have, I would have disclosed
Would you disclose the category? Like, we got an offer from a large, marketing services firm. Like, would you get that specific with them?
Yeah. And then, it was a publicly listed firm. And, okay. I mean, I think there's, frankly, to something like, as you say, marketing services or market intelligence or, e-commerce services or whatever is broad and vague enough that, there's any number of companies that could be represented by that.
Who did you think was the most strategic acquirer?
I'm sorry? Who did you think was the most strategic acquirer? Like, where did you think the biggest strategic premium could be made? Yeah, I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it comes down to, and you've mentioned this on on your webinars, but at the end of the day, it comes down to kind of what kind of cash flow and what kind of capability do you end up providing, for the acquirer. So I think we looked at it from that perspective was, which are the companies that are either looking to break into this space where, they can acquire our capability and it'll, be an add-on to what it is that they're already doing, or that they already have some of this and it'll be, synergistic and, and give them that many more clients and help them dominate the space that much more. I will say that sort of all, when all is said and done, the company that acquired us was probably the best strategic fit. And what was this? Why was it strategic for them? So they had actually, so this company is called Market Track, based in Chicago, had been a profitable business starting in the area of sort of promotions intelligence. And they were owned by a private equity firm. They had made a number of acquisitions, including in our space. And they were actually one of our biggest competitors. So, and by the way, this is not the company that came in with the initial offer that we talked about before that I said, meh. They actually came in later, and we can talk about how we got there. But, what made it strategic for them was, number one, they were already making acquisitions. And so it was part of their strategy, to increment, revenues in that way. Number two, they were already a competitor of ours. They already knew us. They knew what it was like to compete against us. They knew we had superior technology. Number three, they had a better sales force than we did. And so they could, for them, it was like Christmas. They could take essentially our product capability, integrated into, their existing portfolio and their and combine it with sort of, what they're already doing in our space, and then provide it to a superior sales force, both in terms of number and in terms of like capability, of what they were doing.
And so they were definitely interested. So fill in the gap between, so certainly Market Track was interested. You had the kind of somewhat lowball offer, and you were starting this a variety of conversations. Did you get additional offers? How did you go from sort of informal networking conversations with CEO to a final consummated transaction with Market Track?
Yeah, so we started, as you said, with the low ball / and I wouldn't even call it low ball. I would say that it was low ball from our perspective. It wasn't low ball from the acquiring, the prospective acquirer's perspective. I think they were doing what they felt they could do, essentially.
I care about your perspective.
Fair enough.
From your perspective, it was low ball. But keep going.
Yeah. So, and I mentioned that we had another incoming. And so, we used that for the negotiation between these two parties. And, then I was out sort of drumming up interest in other parties as well. I will actually sort of add that, during this time, we also engaged an investment banker to help us in, negotiating and understanding the terms and, keeping us all, like educating sort of not only me, but our board and, walking us through that process and so on, which was very helpful. And, and as I was sort of like drumming up interest with other parties, I actually didn't approach Market Track initially. And the reason I didn't approach them initially was because they were a competitor. And, I'll say that, we had a certain level of concern or paranoia, if you like, that as a competitor, they might, the word of this, if they knew that, we were on the market or having this discussion, that it might get to their sales team, which might get back to our customers and so on. So we certainly had a level of concern about that. So as we were looking at all these different opportunities and negotiating between the two that we did have, the initial offer was the one that, seemed to be most serious. Again, we went and did sort of like presentations with them, large number of their people in the room, felt like the fit and all that kind of stuff. So we were taking it seriously, just to be very clear. And the second one that had come in, they ended up dropping out, or I shouldn't say they dropped out, but they essentially kind of, rather than coming forward with an offer, they ended up saying, well, here's a letter that isn't a letter of intent, but is a letter to say we're interested, but we're not going to proceed to letter of intent, and we want to kind of like learn more. And it was sort of like, what do you want me to do with this letter?
Yeah. I think M&A guys call that like an indication of interest, like IOI, which is sort of like much less formal. Like we'll pay between X and Y, but we need to learn more.
No.
Non-committal.
It didn't even have like a between X and Y. That's what I'm saying.
Oh, right. It's just very vague.
Yeah, it was like, and don't get me wrong. Like, I mean, the individual I was dealing with, who was the CEO of the firm, I mean, I think he was almost embarrassed, to be frank, to put it forward, but it was what his board had, asked him to do. And it was certainly not in line with the discussions we had been having and so on. But anyway, be that as it may, I'm saying wonderful individual, but, at that point I had to say, okay, well, you know what, sorry, I can't do anything with this. So like that's gone. And then, so we still had this initial offer. We had all the other ones that I'd been approaching, and we were getting to the point where we were getting close to sort of signing off on that initial one. And the other ones, I was, using the sort of like time urgency around it to say, hey, we're getting close. If you have an interest, now's the time to step up or don't or whatever. And the iBanker, by the way, was starting to reach out to other parties, et cetera. And, and I would say that the iBanker reaching out, that was only moderately effective, because while there's this notion of, hey, we got this great list and so on, they don't really know the business as well. It's also kind of, they're reaching out to parties that are probably a little bit further afield and so on. So those didn't end up really coming to fruition. But as we were getting down to that stage where we were about to sort of sign off on the first one, I kind of went back to this, Market Track being a competitor, and their CEO had actually reached out to me, like a year or two prior, and we'd had sort of breakfast. And at the time I just kind of said, okay, whatever type thing. But I think it was really wise on his part because, again, they were acquisitive, and he did a really great job of just sort of reaching out to companies in the space and just, getting to know people and establishing a line of contact. And so as it came down to the late stages, I said, you know what, this is going to end up going forward one way or the other. So now the risk of they're going to find out. So now the risk is lower, if you like, or we have nothing really to lose. And so I reached out to him, and he said, yeah, hey, thanks. Really appreciate you reaching out, and let's have a conversation. And we did. And then within a very short period of time, like literally within 2 weeks, the CEO had now moved into a chairman role, and there was a new CEO. So I met the chairman, met the CEO, and, thought, wow, these are good guys. And, within 2 weeks, we had an offer from them that was like over 1.5 times what the, initial offer was.
Wow. And now we're getting into a zone where you're like, okay, this is a fair evaluation. This is an offer that I want to. Yeah.
I mean, it certainly, had all of our investors, happy, and some of them very happy. And, it became an offer that was meaningful enough that, like, all right, this is interesting. Still had the concerns about it being a competitor, to be clear. But when the thing is, when they actually put forward the sort of, the letter of intent, I got to say it was so clean. It really showed their experience in having done all these other acquisitions, because it's, when companies go for financing, there's sort of like, SaaS businesses or, VC funded businesses, you can often kind of judge the VC based upon how clean their terms are, and the more onerous the terms, the more you say kind of like, oh, I don't know if I want to work with them, because frankly, if this is what they're putting forward, it just feels like this is going to end up being a slog for years to come. and so I find that VCs can differentiate themselves based on, nice clean sheets. And I thought, just taking that from an acquisition perspective, what they put forward was so clean, simple, legible, easy, better terms in terms of dollars, less onerous in terms of, kind of residual and so on, that it became a complete no-brainer to go with them.
So what else made it? So if I just want to parse this comment around a clean offer sheet, because I think it's really interesting. So what makes an offer clean? It sounds like the acquisition price is kind of within your what you think is fair. The earn-out component, the transition component, the percentage that's at risk. Are you thinking of that as an earn-out, or you said a holdback? Do you differentiate like an earn-out from, say, an escrow, where it's just really a legal escrow? Like, what are you referring to when you talk about kind of a holdback?
Yeah, so I'm probably a little bit limited in terms of what I can say here, but I will say that between earn-out and escrow and so on, I could probably say it wasn't an earn-out. There was a bit of holdback, but it wasn't, overly significant. It covered their risks. It covered, and it was, it was totally reasonable in the bigger scheme of things. In terms of other elements that were clean, it was also sort of like, what they were looking for in terms of due diligence. It was the period and, duration of due diligence. The original one was looking for 90 days. And this term sheet was sort of like, roughly 4 weeks of due diligence. So,
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And again, like the benefits of selling to a company in the space who is A, experienced with acquisitions, and B, knew us, knew our product, we're essentially, our reputation preceded ourselves, in terms of, what they were willing to do and so on. So I think that's another element. So again, to your point, clean equals how much are they holding back, for how long is the diligence period, what's involved in the diligence, what's involved in terms of actually sort of close, getting from where we are now and signing this letter of intent to actual close.
Got it. That's super helpful for sure. Were you able to gin up the offer at all? Like the one that came in was more attractive than the original, but were you able to get them to nudge it up a little bit?
Yeah, I would say nudge is probably a fair word. We didn't end up getting it. Their offer was already a fair amount higher than the other one, but beyond that, we still were able to negotiate it a bit higher.
Yeah.
But all said, I think it ended up being fair for our team, but I think it was also a very fair acquisition for them. I personal philosophy here. I think that, at the end of the day, some of us are going to be in this for the long term, and, it's not necessarily one-shot deals. And I think it's important that everybody walk away from a deal feeling happy, not anyone feeling, like they got screwed in the process.
So you weren't looking to drive like every, deal term, every dollar that you possibly could. You were looking for the triple win, if you will, or whatever.
Triple win is right.
Yeah. Fantastic. So what was the most surprising thing about the diligence process? They said in the LOI it would take 4 weeks. What came up that you were like, that's a curveball? I never expected that one.
So something that came up pretty quickly, and I think that I'm pretty sure they actually mentioned this before we signed. I can't recall exactly, but as it turned out, our acquirer was in the process themselves of getting acquired. So imagine kind of one of these like small fish, medium fish, bigger fish, type of situations. So they were owned by a private equity firm. They had been owned by them for 4 years. And they happened to be in a situation where that private equity firm was transitioning out, was going to be selling them off. They had actually been on doing their own roadshow to get acquired, and they were in the process of getting acquired by yet another private equity firm. So transitioning from like private equity firm A to private equity firm B.
Sure.
And so when we found that out, or when the CEO shared it with me, which I obviously appreciate his candor, totally above board guy, just said like, look, for transparency, I got to let you know this type of thing. And they weren't it had not been closed with the new acquirer yet. So in effect, he was disclosing something to me, and showing vulnerability on his side, just as I was concerned about the vulnerability we were showing a prospective competitor. He was equally, showing some vulnerability by sharing with us, that they were in this process. And their close, I shouldn't say the close, but they ended up determining who they were going to be going with while we were in the midst of this sort of like 4-week due diligence period. By the way, the 4-week ended up getting stretched to 5, but whatever, sort of 4 or 5 week due diligence period. So that was certainly generate some additional anxiety for us,
How did you protect yourself in that context?
Yeah. So I don't know that we had a way of protecting ourselves against, the issue of their being acquired. I will say that we put protections in terms of the fact that they were a competitor of ours. Again, I think, the individuals, the CEO's behavior to share that with us gave us a lot of comfort that this was an individual, who was, dealing in good faith and integrity. But by the same token, the last thing we wanted to do was completely open the kimono on who our customers were. So we staged the disclosures, of what we'd be providing to them in due diligence, when. And so for example, we could provide them things around suppliers and financials and so on. That could be very early stages. We'd get into, revenues and people and so on. Maybe that's kind of like phase 2. And then like phase 3, the late stages would be more, would be anything to do with actual sort of like identities of customers or reference calls with customers to actually verify that, they're pleased with our service.
How did they reference check with customers without tipping off that they were looking to acquire you? Like, what was their talk track?
Yeah, I think at that stage, good question. I think at that stage, I can't recall whether we actually talked about, looking at establishing a partnership together, or whether we were, frankly, just open with the client, with the client saying, listen, this is going to likely be happening in the, very near future. And, we'd appreciate your speaking with the prospective acquirer. I think, in fact, we were open with those clients. I mean, they were going to find out soon enough. Like literally, this is like a space of sort of a week or, week and a half away from when they'd be finding out.
That's interesting. So the stage disclosures was intentional because you were dealing with a competitor and you wanted to know if the thing was going to go off the rails, you weren't left, having exposed something about your business that you would not have wanted to.
Yeah, it was very intentional. It was very, planned. And I was even very transparent with them. Like, this is the way we're going to do it. Hope that's okay with you. And I think there's signals you pick up, right? I mean, I think it was a positive signal. They shared with us what they did. It would also be a signal to us if they were, no, we need to know this right away. The fact that they were reasonable about that. They understood, they were empathetic about it. That obviously, communicated to us about who they were as people and as an acquirer.
Yeah. But one thing that I'm still sort of unclear on is, so you're dealing with the CEO who is also kind of reporting to, in quotes, a private equity group who owns the company. And that private equity group is selling its share, selling its position to another private equity group. So while it sounds like the relationship you had with the CEO was one of mutual trust and respect, what did you do to ensure that the private equity group, either like the incumbent or the new one, didn't derail the deal? Because ultimately they still controlled the purse strings, I would think.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to be frank, I don't think we actually had any contact with the acquiring PE firm, or if we did, it was only very late stages. It was all sort of handled between the CEO, the selling PE firm. They obviously had shared with the acquiring PE firm that, hey, late breaking, news kind of thing. We have this opportunity. We showed you our sort of acquisition pipeline. Here's this, company that was one of our top targets, and we're now in a situation where we can do this. So I think it was one of those situations where we had to take them on, on trust and good faith that they were managing that element of it.
Did you ensure that in the LOI, did they stipulate that they had received board approval to make the offer, or was it contingent on board approval?
Good question. I don't recall exactly. There was nothing in it that gave us any concern that it wouldn't move forward. So I'm going to say it either had board approval or, I mean, with these kinds of acquisitions, especially with a PE firm, they're typically very involved, depending on the size of the company, the size of the acquisition, and so on. So when we were going through that process, not only were we dealing with the CEO and the members of the leadership team and so on, but we were frequently interacting with the PE owners. And, they were often asking us for information because then they put it into their models, which they then would feed back, presumably, to what, the acquisition or their sale process.
And how would you characterize the difference in tenor between your conversations with the private equity group, the selling private equity group, and the CEO of the operational company?
They actually worked together pretty closely. So we were the 12th acquisition in 4 years. Wow. So in that period of time, they had, gone through this exercise a number of times, and they knew that, anytime there was this kind of an acquisition, the PE firm would be very involved. So I would say, while the types of information that the PE firm was looking for were different, typically more financial based, risks and so on, it didn't feel like it was a completely different kind of interaction. I mean, obviously with the CEO, he wants to make sure that it makes business sense and, operationally can work and there's a cultural fit and so on. I think the PE firms are less concerned about those kinds of things.
Culture schmulture. How are we going to make money? Damn it. Yeah. Keep going. Okay. Did they play a little bad cop, good cop off each other?
Not really. I actually found that they were all very sort of friendly. It actually gave, I was surprised at how much that was the case. There wasn't really any contentious element to this negotiation. And frankly, I don't know whether that to some extent, maybe that was a little bit of kind of timing issues on their side. Like if this had been a longer due diligence, it kind of gives you more time to sort of dig into stuff and maybe push back and so on. But I think that the 4 to 5 week due diligence was in part because they were in their own sale process and partly because they knew us and, and our reputation preceded us and so on. But I think partly maybe affected as well by the fact that they were, in their own sale process. And so it wasn't really in their interest to kind of drag things out. So why sort of rake up mud unnecessarily? And they didn't do that. I mean, it was honestly very smooth. The one thing I will say, that, and it's not at all an issue of contention, but we have to prove, above and beyond sort of they knew us and so on. I remember distinctly we had a meeting where we were talking about, technologically how, we felt that our product was superior and they generally had a notion that it was as well, but there was a little bit of a sort of prove it. Mm-hmm. And that prove it was, okay, coming away from this, meeting that we had in Chicago, they gave us a set of different products and said, show us what you can do. And we did. And I knew and this is midway through the due diligence process, I knew that, wow, this is put up or shut up, type of thing. We really need to demonstrate that technologically we're going to end up coming up with better results than they can. And we passed that with flying colors.
I was going to say, presumably you aced that exam.
Yeah, it's not to say that, we didn't have some anxiety around it. We knew we had a superior product, or at least we had every reason to believe that we did. Mm-hmm. But until you actually prove it, it's unproven. And so, to do that and to have them come away saying okay, yeah, you nailed that. Yeah, we're doing the right thing here.
Got it. Excellent.
Really affirming.
What was your reaction when diligence slipped from 4 weeks as promised to 5?
Yeah, and the slip was actually there were just a couple of minor sort of issues that led to the slip. It was sort of supposed to be 4 weeks, and then all the documents signed, cashing in the bank and so on. And the slip was literally 5 to 7 days type of thing. One, there was a small, I'm going to say small in retrospect, but when you're at that stage, everything feels huge, legal issue that came up, and, it was sort of really, and it wasn't that they weren't trying to extract anything. It was just their counselors became concerned about something. And I think from a business perspective, they felt, you know what, this is reasonable, but their counselors were advising them a certain way. And then our counselors were, pushing back and so on. So I just remember being on phone calls saying, look, it was enough. It caused anxiety that it could really derail the deal in the very last minute. But fortunately, we were able to kind of cooler heads prevail. And
do you remember what the deal point was?
It was essentially around, the nature of sort of crawling websites generally. And it was a business that they were already in. And there was some new regulation that might come out or, that was going to come out, and it could cause some concern. But really, we were doing the same thing they were. So it's sort of like, if you're concerned about us doing it, you should be concerned about yourself doing it. It doesn't add anything to your existing risk. And honestly, it became like a complete non-issue. And the second point of delay was just around cash hitting the bank. They're arranging, getting the numbers, getting the financing through and so on. And, again, when you're in the very late stages and you're expecting that money to hit the bank and everybody's sort of geared up for it and you're gearing up to tell your company and your investors are all expecting it and so on, any delay, causes some level of anxiety and stress. But, and you kind of had to say, well, didn't we know this was coming? But anyway, so that got resolved. And then of course it was the, sigh of relief when everything went through.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a great story and I'm grateful for you sharing it in such detail. Where can people reach out if they wanted to get to know you more? Is LinkedIn the best spot, or what's the best way to send people to you?
Yeah. I mean, if there's anything that was useful here and, I'd love to, if someone can get some benefit out of the experience that I had, you can look me up on LinkedIn, Alexander Rink, R-I-N-K. Again, I go by Alex, but that's how I'm listed in LinkedIn. You got
to be a Canadian to have the name Rink.
You wouldn't believe how many times I've actually got to spell it for people, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Rink like a hockey rink, all right?
Exactly. And then I also have a website, which is www.rinkventures.com.
Awesome. So it's Alexander Rink on LinkedIn or Rink Ventures on the web.
Yep.
Alex, it was a pleasure. Thank you for doing this.
Likewise. Thanks very much, John, for all that you do to help educate, us entrepreneurs on being more effective on, running our businesses.
Oh my gosh. My pleasure.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Built to Sell Radio with John Warrillow. For complete show notes with links to additional resources, visit builttosell.com/blog. John is the founder of the Value Builder System. To find out how to improve the value of your business by 71%, visit valuebuildersystem.com. John is also the author of Built to Sell, Creating a Business That Can Thrive Without You, and The Automatic Customer, Creating a Subscription Business in Any Industry. Connect with John at facebook.com/built-to-sell or on Twitter at John Warrillow, WARRILLOW. Thanks for listening.